This is The World Unpacked. In 1987, a young historian who had previously focused most of his career on the British Navy wrote a book that became an instant classic. The thesis of the book, which propelled so much discussion and debate in Washington, was that great powers rise and fall, and the driving forces behind their ascent and descent are economic durability and military overstretch. This historian is, of course, Paul Kennedy. In his latest book, Victory at Sea, Naval Power and the Transformation of the Global Order in World War II, he shows how American ingenuity combined with manufacturing capacity to transform the United States into the Allies' hope for victory and set it on a path to superpower status. When he's not writing, he's a renowned professor at Yale where he teaches a famous course on grand strategy. He's joining me today to talk about the book, why he wrote it, and what lessons from World War II can apply to our new era of great power competition. He also happens to be my brother-in-law, and if our conversation here is half as interesting as the ones we have over dinner, we're in for a real treat. Here we go.
If anybody asks you what the Americans are doing in this war, tell them you've seen this bit of it. U.S. Navy task force in the Southwest Pacific. A Japanese fleet somewhere over the horizon. Japanese torpedo and dive bombers coming in now to attack this aircraft carrier.
Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I want to start at the beginning, and not the beginning of the book, but what might have drawn you to write it. You were born in Wallsend in northern England, which is an area famous for its shipyards. And I know members of your family worked in the docks, helping to build ships that were deployed and fought in the war. Was this sort of the early fascination you had with ships?
I think so. And I would say that many authors write sometime in their lives with reference back to where they were born or what their circumstance was. I was born in a row house area close to the shipyard in which my father and my two uncles worked. One could hear the hammer of the construction of the merchant ships and the warships. So, and I grew up in that circumstance until I went through grammar school to the University of Newcastle and then on down to Oxford. But I think it meant that I knew quite a lot about ships, quite a lot about shipbuilding. I was fairly proud of what those industries had done, especially in the great Second World War and a certain amount of Nazi bombing and other things. And so that always stayed in the back of my mind. And it was easy for me when I wanted to move away from doing a book on diplomatic history or a book on reforming the United Nations system to turn back and do like a book called Engineers of Victory, do something about how the Second World War was won or greatly won by the work of engineers. So yes, I had that background somewhere in my blood all my life.
So let's turn to the book itself. The scope of the entire war and of this book is really too grand for this humble podcast. So instead, I want to focus on a couple key turning points that you write about. And I want to start with the innovation that turned the tide for the Allies against the German U-boats. But let's set the scene and talk about the events leading to a very important battle on May 5th, 1943. The attacks that the U-boats were conducting against convoys were so great that Winston Churchill feared the British Navy might be sunk. Can you talk about the German strategy and the U-boat attacks on the convoys and why they were so successful?
This is now the fourth year of the Great Battle of the Atlantic. The German U-boat system, led by their redoubtable leader, Admiral Dönitz, was able to put an enormous number of fresh U-boats into the Atlantic to try to cut the major artery of all of the Allied war effort, which is the Atlantic convoys. And by April 1943, they were doing a very good job of it, and in fact had devastated one such convoy coming from New York over to Liverpool and Glasgow, that Churchill and the Admiralty thought that they might even abandon the convoy system and just send individual ships, half of them sunk, half of them not, as an alternative. So, but at that very time, at the low point, in May 1943, certain things happened on the British Royal Navy side, which were a great turnaround, chiefly due to technology. The creation of a miniaturized form of radar, not the giant radar sets on the south coast of England, which could detect the oncoming Luftwaffe, but miniaturized radar, which could go on the just in a little antennae on the top of small defense warships like frigates or destroyers, escorting the convoys, escorting the merchant ships one way and another. The particular merchant ship convoy that you are referring to is referred to as number ONS-5. The ships are empty. They're returning to the United States, but they're still as vital because they need their cargo places to be filled up, and then they will turn about and carry goods back to the United Kingdom. Dönitz is determined to inflict a massive defeat on this convoy, and he has no less than 4 U-boat Wolf squadrons in line to attack. And in fact, the roles are reversed because in the incredible mists of the Atlantic coast, when the U-boats come in to attack on the surface, they are blinded by the mists. At nighttime, they're blinded by the dark. And for the first real time in the war, these small group of sloops and frigates and corvettes have the breakthrough technology of being able to see in the dark. That is a miniaturized radar, and are able to detect the German warships on the surface, maybe as much as a mile away, go after them, drive them underground, under the surface, and drop their bombs or their depth charges on top of them. The result is 5 sunk U-boats, many more rather badly damaged. Some merchant ships are lost, but not enough. And Dönitz begins to realize then that if this continues to happen, as he puts it in his diary, we will have lost the Battle of the Atlantic. It's a very good example of new technologies and organization, as well as the courage of the individuals, beginning to turn the war around in the middle of 1943.
So that battle that led to such a catastrophic defeat for the German U-boats, as you mentioned, was built on the back of a small disc that really was kind of a new type of radar. And it was developed, I believe, by some British postdoc researchers and then produced by Bell Labs in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about how that came to pass and how such a small innovation could have such a huge impact on the war?
If listeners and readers are interested, and if you're ever up in Cambridge, Mass, and you go to the small MIT History of Technology Museum, there's a little one there on Massachusetts Avenue, and you go to the second floor, there in a glass container is a small thing, a small pod about the size of a soup bowl, and that is a miniaturized radar system. And that was invented by a couple of, and so it's mass produced by Bell Labs, and the technology of putting it into, say, the nose of a Liberator bomber aircraft and getting rid of all of the technical snafus which happen when you're putting a lot of electricity with metal, etc. That was worked out by MIT. So MIT and Bell Labs will say the miniaturized radar was invented here. But it was that little pod which was brought across by a British technical mission given to Vannevar Bush, the chief science advisor to Roosevelt, and developed on this side of the Atlantic. But it comes from a very funny, almost fairy story tale, Douglas, of these 2 postdocs at Birmingham University, which was one of the physics department asked if they could help in the story of miniaturizing the very, very large 15-meter radar systems down to something as big as my hands here. And they discovered by doing an experiment on the side of the Bristol Channel that they could send out one particular beam. If it hit something moving on the other side of this bit of English landscape, and it hit something metal and the ping came back, they had discovered this miniaturized radar. The British at that time certainly didn't have the technical productive capacities to mass produce it, so it's brought over to this side. And a little later on, as I tell in the book, it is put into these small escort warships just in time to turn the Battle of the Atlantic.
That's an incredible story of innovation, and I'm sure it was all conducted quickly during the war. Necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. But I want to turn to a sort of a larger turning point in the war, and I literally mean larger. I'm talking about the sheer tonnage of ships churned out by the United States following the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Robert E. Perry, Kaiser's men send a prefabricated ship down the ways in 4 days, 15 and a half hours. Think of it. The Axis sneered at our production might, but it's haunting their dreams today.
So from 1942 to 1945 in shipyards from Chester, Pennsylvania to San Francisco, thousands of merchant vessels, carriers, and escorts were produced. And you basically argue in the book that it was this sheer scale of the American war economy that dwarfed all the other major powers combined in the war and led to the Allied victory. Can you talk a little more about the scope and the production capacity the United States was able to muster compared to the other great powers?
Let's begin with the biggest point of all, which is already by the First World War, the United States had the productive capacity because of the coming of the Industrial Revolution all across this giant country, from the East Coast to Pittsburgh to the far West. It had a far bigger productive capacity than others, but that capacity was reduced severely by the Great Depression. Nobody was building ships in the late 1920s, nobody giving orders for warships apart from very few exceptions, namely in Imperial Japan. What the United States Navy did in its procurement policies, Doug, was, I find quite interesting, which was to give smallish subsidies to a select number of U.S. government yards and another set of small subsidies to the yards of some rather large private capital companies to keep them going, just to keep them through in times of scarcity. And you might ask, are we doing something the same today if we ever had to do a surge of our productive capacities for, say, doubling the fleet? The capacities were there, ticking over, as it were, until the U.S. Senate got totally frightened by the news in June 1940 of the fall of France. And in one particular day where the Navy had come along to request a largish increase in naval allocations, the Senate and especially the Congress, the Navy subcommittee of the Congress, decided on that day to double the size of the Navy budget. In essence, they were allocating enough money which was equal to the total budget of the Japanese Navy. But that's in 1940, Doug, and what it means is if you're going to order the laying down of the large and complicated Essex-class aircraft carriers or the large 16-inch gun U.S. Navy Washington-class battleships, they take 4 to 5 years to construct and then to launch and then to get worked up and then with the crews in before they actually get to the fighting place itself. This is why the critical years of the British holding on in 40 to 41 are part of a U.S. story as well. This is why after the successful Battle of Midway in the middle of June 1942, there is a hiatus except for fighting down in the Solomons because the productive capacities are still not finished. And it's, as I tell in the book, it's only in like the beginning of June 1943 that the great American Admiral Chester Nimitz, leader of the Pacific Ocean Fleet, could see the first Essex-class carriers coming into Pearl Harbor, one aircraft carrier every month. And the backdrop of that, as you well know, is the enormous productive capacity of the American shipyards, as well as the aircraft production and everything else. It goes from steel, it goes back to aluminum, it goes back to the production of ball bearings, absolutely critical. All of those are produced in this country by 1943, 44, 3 times to 4 times to 6 times more than any of the other combatants in the war.
One big change that happened in naval strategy as a result of the war is the primacy of the aircraft carrier. Can you talk about how that came to pass after Pearl Harbor?
It's worth remembering that the admirals in charge of all of the major navies in the 1930s were brought up as battleship admirals. And the first years of the war on the oceans outside, the coasts of Britain and France and in the Mediterranean, only partly showed that this might happen. But the great battle fleet encounters were hopefully going to be occurring between the Japanese battle fleet and the American battle fleet if and when a war occurred in the Pacific. And the beginning of the Pacific War, as everybody knows, was a surprise attack by masses of Japanese aircraft carriers on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, which wiped out for essentially the American battle fleet as it was. The later battle fleet is to come after 1943, brand new battleships, but by then, the nature of naval war, especially in the wide expanses of the Pacific, had altered. The key instrument of the Pacific War was the aircraft carrier with 2 or 3 other aircraft carriers, so it could be an aircraft carrier group carrying maybe 200 or more bombers of a great destructive nature, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and they were the ones which went out to win the war in the Pacific. The age of the battleship was over. Repeatedly, the Japanese admirals tried to get the U.S. Navy to come and have a battleship encounter. It didn't happen. It didn't happen one time. It didn't happen another time. The great trap which was planned at the so-called Battle of Leyte Gulf in the middle of 1944 led to various Japanese battleships being attacked by literally hundreds and hundreds of U.S. carrier aircraft and being sunk and driven to the bottom. The battleship era was over, and in a sense, it was over at Pearl Harbor.
When we come back, I'll ask Paul about the lessons today's policymakers can draw from history and whether the U.S. is up to meeting the challenges of this new era of great power politics. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. We have a lot of fun putting this show together, but we can't do it without your generous support. To support the work that we do on this podcast and the work of the Carnegie Endowment, please visit ceip.org/donate. Thanks. Paul, let's pick up right where we left off. You talked about how the battleship became outmoded during World War II by the carrier. Today, we have cheap drones, lethal anti-ship missiles capable of traveling huge distances. And just last April, the Ukrainians sunk a Russian flagship in the Black Sea. So in this modern era of security competition, is naval power still as important as it once was?
It certainly is, but it's probably going to be transformed again by new technologies, including the ones that you mentioned, which are, super sophisticated sea-skimming missiles, missiles which can be dropped from a bomber with a very significant airhead, torpedoes which can be dropped from a bomber, which are for a while a fast-moving missile in the air and then go under the water to become a torpedo. It's very difficult for any Navy, however powerful, to deal with that. Very difficult for any Navy to think of coming close to a shoreline in the Persian Gulf, off the Lebanese coast, where the Russians have put large numbers of surface-to-ship missiles around, and particularly off the coast of China, which has tens of thousands of missile launchers there now. So we have the largest surface navy in the world. We have by far the most powerful big fleet carriers of the Nimitz class and the forthcoming Ford class. The question is, will they survive in an age of a new technological transformation? Are the drones and are the sophisticated sea-skimming missiles and the underwater torpedoes going to lead to making anachronistic the big surface weapon systems in the way the battleship was made anachronistic 70 years ago?
Another part of the book that comes across very clearly and may have lessons for today is the access to the steady supply of raw materials that go into making weapons, ships, and so forth. One famous example you cite in the book is the mining of bauxite in Suriname in Latin America. That was such a crucial element of the development of aluminum planes that became one of the United States' most effective weapons for air power. So do you see similar resource constraints developing now in our current geopolitical climate, for example, over rare earth minerals?
Yes, very, very clear analogy. It's interesting to back off and talk a little about what happened in the making of this book, Victory at Sea. I was almost close to finishing it 2 years ago and was reading each day about sort of supply chain snafus, or reading other articles about our dependence upon particular high-tech microchips from Taiwan or from South Korea, making items which go towards large weapon systems or large electronic systems in this country, but ultimately have their creative source somewhere across the Pacific. And that particular sources depend upon rare earths, which are somewhere in China. And there was a question also, Doug, of whether there would be sufficient supply of newsprint to get my book published. So I was acutely aware of resource links and supply chains. And it occurred to me that I might illustrate this in a very specific way by persuading Yale University Press to allow me to have this particular addendum at the end, this appendix, which takes the story of the supply chain of the bauxite ore in the bauxite mountains of Dutch Suriname and British Guyana, that is in Latin America, transported in ore carriers across to the United States, transported by barges up to the great Alcoa Aluminum Corporation of American refinery, turned into all sorts of aluminum slabs and pods, and sent on to be the absolutely central parts of our aircraft and our various other parts, especially aircraft, in the Second World War. Most of the victory-winning aircraft of the Second World War depend upon being lightweight in aluminum, for everything from their propeller to the cladding of the aircraft themselves, and the supply chain is vital. And if we don't understand the linkages between the rear end of war and that front end of war, we're really not very good military historians at all.
Besides the supply chain issues, there's also something that's happened since the United States victory in the Second World War, which is about production capacity. During the war, the U.S. was not only producing ships, but was the factory, the arsenal of democracy, right? A factory of guns, weapons, everything supplying the Allies' war effort. You fast forward to the 21st century, and China is now producing modern warships at an unbelievable rate. I think something like 90% of the world's merchant ships are now built in Asia. The U.S. Navy is planning to shrink the size of its fleet, and American manufacturing capacity for nearly everything, including ships, has been scaled back, outsourced, globalized. So what are the implications of this for the U.S.-China security competition in particular?
If you are one of those economists who believe in the rationality of economic exchange and getting profit and the integrated world order, that the world is flat, and you think that the more we sell to the Chinese and the more we invest in China, and the more they buy American government bonds, and the more we purchase from them, we become ever more integrated, and this world will not be disrupted. If you have that vision of a world order in the 21st and 22nd century, where all will be well and there will be no major war, then this is all right. You can go to other forms of making a profit. If you believe that the sinews of productive power, the number of trained engineers you have, the number of ball bearing plants you have at home, the safety of your supply lines to produce things in the future which your nation might need if things went wrong. We're talking about this in the shadow of a total disruption of our economic and technological relationships with Moscow. We are imposing all sorts of economic bans on the Russians. We are trying to throttle them economically so that Mr. Putin will behave himself and turn to a negotiating table. They are threatening all sorts of ways in which they can damage us economically. And we begin to think, oh my word, the world is not flat. The world is the same as that described almost by Thucydides or by Clausewitz or by writers just before the Second World War. Be prepared. It doesn't mean you want war, you just have to be technologically and productively prepared if something comes to your nation and you have to mobilize your resources. What if there's no more factories or trained, skilled workforce left for you?
You teach some of the brightest aspiring young minds in foreign policy at Yale, and a famous course is the Grand Strategy Program, which is a study that fuses U.S. foreign policy making in the broader context of influential voices in statecraft across not just American history, but human history. So you've taken a pretty good look at this. You look at the United States today. Do you think that foreign policy leaders in this country have a coherent grand strategy for U.S. foreign policy in the coming decades?
No, I don't. It's not surprising that the grand strategy is a very bold and holistic concept. It actually comes out of a study of the Second World War, a 6-volume British official history called Grand Strategy. Not just your strategy in the Atlantic, not just your strategy in protecting merchant ships, not just your Mediterranean strategy, not just your diplomacy towards Stalin's Russia, but all of that integrated and fused together with a decision-making system at the center which recognizes that there are all of these subparts which have to go into it. And moreover, this grand strategy concept is not one for the winning of total war, as in the Second World War. It's how you ensure the long-term security and safety of the United States and its allies in an insecure and turbulent world. Have we got all of the parts together? Do we have the best diplomacy for up and down across east and west and north and south of our world? Do we have a sufficient backup systems in the productive elements which we've talked about? Do we have a good coherent linkage between our various armed services so they're not quarreling with each other? Make sure that the U.S. Navy is only beginning to think of fighting in the Pacific and the Army thinking only of land warfare in Germany. Who puts it all together? And the answer to that is, as Clausewitz's answer, it has to be the political, as he calls it, has to be the political central decision-making. So in the case of this country, obviously, it comes to the President of the United States, his main cabinet officials, and the National Security Council, and the Pentagon leaders in an integrated form. It's a very hard juggling act to demand of anybody, Douglas, because we have these interests, we have these bases, we have these alliance security systems all over the globe. Can we fit them all together in peacetime in a fused and coherent way without, by the way, overbalancing ourselves and spending far too much on defense as opposed to spending too little on defense? Can we get the pace of things right? This is a demand we make of our political leaders in any presidency we have. You can say, well, the previous president didn't understand this at all, which is why strategic thinkers groaned and moaned at the 4 years of the Trump presidency, and this is why we're still hopeful or critical of the way the current White House is doing it. Some of them giving a pretty good B+ grade for what's happening, others being very fearful that this White House does not have a long-term grand strategy that fits.
There's a great quote from Winston Churchill where he said, "Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And I know you're a big Churchill fan, as am I. Is there a particular lesson from your book, Victory at Sea, that you would emphasize to world leaders that they understand and take away from it, perhaps applying to their current challenges?
And it's not just Churchill, but others who have said those who, do not understand will be punished by not understanding. Those who do not understand the past will have to relearn it. Because the argument there is that there are long-term patterns and lessons in history. And your best guide to the future is to actually have a acute historical sense in the way that Churchill had. Yes, without being obsessed about a historical model which would count absolutely today, no transfer of a circumstance fits all. No historical example can be turned to today or for the future and be exactly right. But if you understand that you need at the center of this a careful, rational, balancing, decision-making process, taking into account the internal and the external strengths and weaknesses of our own society and its allies vis-a-vis the strengths and weaknesses of those potential foes of ours, you're probably as close to getting a good grand strategy as you may hope for.
Everyone should go out and buy Victory at Sea. It's a great book. It has beautiful paintings of the battleships and carriers that Paul describes by the late Ian Marshall. So it's not only a wonderful read, but it's an amazing visual experience, beautifully written. And we'll put a link to buy it in the show notes. Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about the book and all these other important issues.
Douglas, thank you. It was a great privilege, an honor to be on, and most enjoyable, if I may say so.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The World Unpacked, a podcast produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you like the show, please rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero, and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. See you next time.